I think I've just witnessed my worst nightmare, which is getting up in front of a room full of 400 strangers in a dressing gown and having to get naked. So thank you for that. That's kind of calmed my nerves significantly. So I'm going to be starting off, really, by talking a little bit about how sleep can be messy and how good sleep can actually tidy up your life a little. And I think that really, the next two videos that I'm going to show you are perhaps the most potent illustration of how sleep can be messy. These two videos are of individuals, and you'll notice in the videos that their brain waves are being recorded. We know that they're in the very deepest stages of sleep, so really deep sleep, what we term stage 3 or slow wave sleep. And yet, they're doing this.
No, Mum! No! Mum, stop! Mum, please stop me! If I press it, I'm gonna die! No, you're not gonna. No, yes, I am! No, you're not. No!
So this young boy is in very, very deep sleep, clearly is engaging with his mother, not entirely sensibly, but is talking, is looking around, can obviously see. When he wakes up, he can't remember anything that's happened. So this is an example of a sleep terror. This other gentleman is, again, in very deep sleep. Given for thinking that actually he's awake. He's behaving as if he's awake, although not entirely sensibly. He certainly looks awake. So I think what these two videos really very much demonstrate is that sleep, firstly, is not simply an off state of the brain. It's not simply a point for 8 hours during which you go offline and nothing happens in your brain. There's lots of things that are happening in your brain. And what we now know, and we've known for quite some time, is that there are various stages of sleep through which we cycle over the course of the night. So for the average person in this room, the likelihood is that you will go through about 4 or 5 cycles of sleep, with the majority of your deep sleep being in the first half of the night. Every 90 minutes or so, you'll go into REM sleep, which is the stage of sleep that we most associate with dreaming of a narrative structure, so those plot-like stories that evolve over the course of the night, and then you'll dip back out of REM sleep, back into non-REM sleep, doing the majority of your dreaming, the majority of your REM sleep, over the course of the night. But even that is a gross oversimplification, because what those two videos show us is they show us that actually sleep does not affect the whole of the brain at the same time in most individuals. And actually, in those videos that I showed you, those individuals exhibit something called local sleep. In those individuals, the parts of the brain that we're recording from, what constitutes very deep sleep, are the parts of the brain, the frontal lobes, that are responsible for rational thinking, for planning, for consciousness, for awareness, for judgment. And also other parts of the brain, this area called the hippocampus, which is the area of the brain that's responsible for memory, which is why many people who exhibit these kinds of behaviors, and the sorts of things that people do is sleepwalking, sleep talking. I've seen people ride a motorbike in their sleep, drive a car in their sleep, rewire televisions in their sleep. So some of the stuff that people can do can be really quite complicated indeed. Yet the parts of the brain that exhibit some waking behavior are the parts of the brain that are responsible for vision, for movement, and importantly for emotion, which is this area of the brain called the limbic system, which is often why individuals who exhibit these kinds of behaviors in sleep exhibit very, very strong emotions, fear, anger, that kind of thing. So we've moved on a little bit from sleep just being an off state. We've moved on a little bit from there just being these 3 or 4 stages of sleep overnight to understanding that actually different parts of the brain can exist in different stages of sleep or indeed wake at the same time. We've known this for years in animals. So animals like dolphins, like whales, like certain birds, certain amphibians, can sleep with one half of their brain at a time. And you can understand why they might have evolved that process because they still need to be able to surface, to breathe. If they're aquatic mammals, they still need to be aware of what's going on around them whilst they're sleeping. So it really demonstrates that evolution has certainly demonstrated that sleep is of utmost importance if it's gone to such lengths in order to allow these organisms to sleep, even when they're having to do all of this. So what about in humans? Can we sleep with half of our brains at the same time? Well, we can't, but there is some evidence that actually, and many of you will have experienced this, when you sleep for the first time in a strange environment, in a hotel room, your sleep will be of less good quality than at other times. And by the time you then get to your second or your third night, actually your sleep gets much better. And what we can demonstrate is that in that first night in a strange environment, actually in your dominant hemisphere, in the dominant half of your brain, the sleep is much less deep than it is the second, the third night. So we do have some of those mechanisms available to us to control the different halves of our brain simultaneously in sleep. But perhaps more importantly, what we're now beginning to understand is that sleep affects all of you. Now, I'm very used to giving talks to patients, to patient groups, and at this stage, about 70% of people are already asleep in my talks. So I'm quite pleased to see lots of open eyes. But actually, what we're now beginning to understand is that all of us are a little bit asleep, even when we're wide awake. That constantly, the outer lining of our brains, the cerebral cortex, is dipping in and out of sleep, little islands of sleep. So basically radio silence in small clumps of neurons that are there whilst we're fully awake. And actually, as we get more tired, as we take up particular cognitive tasks, those periods of radio silence, those areas of the brain that are involved in those islands of sleep, get larger and larger and longer, which is perhaps one of the reasons why our cognitive function declines when we're sleep deprived or when we're fatigued in other ways. And in fact, this has been demonstrated not only in humans, but also other mammals like rats and mice. And it may be that this concept of local sleep is actually applicable to the vast majority of people who say they don't sleep well at night. So insomnia is an incredibly common condition. It affects about 10% of the adult population on a chronic basis. About 30% of the adult population will experience a period of insomnia in any one year. But actually, for the most part, when we record people's brain waves and they say that they've had a very poor night's sleep, that they've had very limited sleep, the total duration of their sleep is actually not that much different from normal individuals. And many of the individuals that I see in my sleep lab who we bring in and record, who complain bitterly of having slept only 1 or 2 hours, when you pull out the hypnogram, that graph that I showed you earlier, it demonstrates that they slept 7.5 hours, and they are convinced that you must have been recording somebody else. So actually, what do we think is going on in these individuals? Well, actually, that's also another example of local sleep, in that for those individuals, some more recent work has demonstrated that whilst the majority of the brain remains asleep, those parts of the brain that are responsible for awareness, for consciousness, seem to be exhibiting some sort of waking behavior. So you are actually asleep, although you are aware while you're asleep. So this concept of wake, REM sleep, and non-REM sleep is really even more complicated, because there are all these areas of overlap, conditions that some of you may have experienced, things like sleep paralysis or hallucinations as you drift off to sleep or wake up. These all happen at the interface between these different stages of sleep. And so sleep is really very messy indeed, even for the majority of us, for those of us who don't have any sleep disorders. So what about what impact sleep has on our messy world, on understanding our messy world? Well, in our day-to-day lives, we consider the way that we understand the world to be a case of our senses, our eyes, our ears, our skin, other sensory organs, taking information from all around us, funneling it to our brains, and that's how we know what's going on in the world around us. But actually, the reality is somewhat different, in that our current understanding of how we understand the world is that the brain is actually a prediction machine. Everything that we experience is really what the brain predicts And it's only when there is a major clash between what our senses are providing us and what our expectation of the world is that we change our minds. And that's one of the reasons why many of the illusions that you'll be familiar with that you see in the textbooks or on usually the Daily Mail's scroll bar of shame that you see work, because those are essentially when we are predicting what we're going to see rather than seeing what's actually on the piece of paper or on the screen in front of us. So why do we need to predict? Why does the brain need to work in this way? Well, there are three major problems with taking all the information that's around us and reconstructing our world at any given moment. The first is that the system hasn't got enough bandwidth. Our nervous system is unable to take all the billions, the trillions of bits of information that are happening on an instantaneous basis, funneling it to the brain, and then reconstructing our world on a moment-by-moment basis. The second issue is that, in reality, we all live in the past. And there's a really good illustration of that at the moment if you're watching Wimbledon, because if Andy Murray is serving at you at 131 miles an hour, essentially by the time the light leaves the ball as it's leaving his racket, it's reaching your eye, those electrical signals are reaching the areas of the brain that are responsible for conscious vision. It's about 140 milliseconds. So essentially, by the time you're aware of the ball leaving his racket, the ball is hitting you in the face. So we're always living a little bit in the past. And obviously, that has got major implications for our survival. You know, if we only see the saber-toothed tiger jumping out from behind a rock by the time it's got its teeth wrapped around our neck, that's not very good for our evolutionary perspective. The third issue is that our entire world is ambiguous. And so what I mean by that, this is a really good illustration. So if you see a red bus in the distance, well, it could be a big, full-size red bus in the distance, but it could also be a little toy bus that's close to you. So really, there is ambiguity in all the sensory signals that are coming into our brains. And as a result, our nervous system needs to take shortcuts. It needs to have a prediction, a model of the world upon which it bases those predictions. And that's one of the theories as to what happens in... Sorry, let me just go back one sec. That's one of the theories as to what happens during dreaming. Dreaming is an offline state during which we integrate all of our experiences of life, all our experiences of the day, and tweak that internal model of the world, because that internal model of the world changes. It changes according to our experiences. And these are the sorts of illusions that I'm talking about. So this is the rotating mask illusion. We are so hardwired to recognize faces that even when we know we're seeing the inverse of a face, we reconstruct that face as pointing outwards because we're not used to seeing inverted faces. So despite looking at this mask from the back, it is still perceived as being a face projecting towards you. And it's not just vision that is liable to these illusions. Hearing can also be liable to these illusions as well. So this is something called the McGurk effect, which some of you may be familiar with.
Ba ba, ba ba, ba ba. 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 Ba ba, ba ba.
Faces now, and hear what he's saying.
Ba ba, ba ba, ba ba. Ba ba, ba ba, ba ba.
I'm going to shut him up. So in all of those clips, the sound is exactly the same. It's da 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 da. But depending on what you expect to hear, based upon the movements that his lips are making, you will hear different things. And I think that's a really powerful example of how expectation trumps reality. So sleep is not is obviously important for our understanding of the world. It's important for our physical health. So it's been linked with pretty much every condition that you can imagine: blood pressure, heart disease, weight, diabetes, even cancer risk has been associated with circadian rhythm. Very important for psychological health. There are very strong links to anxiety and depression, and those links are not just the case that if you are anxious or depressed, you will sleep badly, but also that if you sleep badly, you will get anxious and depressed. And obviously, as I already alluded to, a whole range of cognitive effects, so alertness, vigilance, creativity, and learning. And indeed, many of you will have come across the increasing evidence that sleep disruption and sleep deprivation is associated with cognitive decline and conditions like Alzheimer's disease. So, the big question, how do I improve my sleep? Well, as I said, insomnia is incredibly common. We know that for the vast majority of people, there are really three major things going on. So the first are of conscious psychological factors. So once your sleep has been disrupted for a little while, a lot of people lie awake in their beds. They feel anxious about the prospect of the night ahead. They feel anxious about the possibility of not being able to fall asleep. They feel frustrated or worried about whether or not they're going to be able to perform the following day, and increasingly with the books and the programs and the articles that are out there, worried about the long-term repercussions to their health. But actually that's only part of the picture. There are a whole range of unconscious psychological factors. So many of you will be familiar with the conditioned response that was described by Pavlov, who rang the bell when he fed his dogs. So we have a very strong conditioned response to bed. We associate bed, for most of us, with being a place where we drift off to sleep, where we fall asleep easily. It's a place of relaxation. But in individuals with insomnia, that unconscious conditioned response has been replaced by a negative conditioned response. So our brain begins to associate bed with being a place where we're awake, where we're hypervigilant, whereby we're exhibit high arousal levels, so we're looking around for danger. And that is probably, those unconscious psychological factors are probably the strongest issue in individuals with insomnia. And if you are very sleep deprived, then you will exhibit changes in terms of certain hormones like adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol, all of which are very conducive towards insomnia. And so people end up in this terrible vicious cycle. So how do we try and treat insomnia? Well, a lot of you will have gone to your GP and been told, well, you need to concentrate on your sleep hygiene. You know, make sure that your bedroom is dark, that it's not too hot, not too cold. Don't drink coffee after midday. Don't have a cigarette just before you go to bed. But actually, while sleep hygiene is really important if you occasionally have a bad night's sleep, it's not going to make the difference between you sleeping like a baby and continuing to have terrible insomnia. It's going to be useless at doing that. And actually, what has happened over the last 20 or 30 years is that whereas in the past you would have been doled out sleeping tablets to help you sleep, we now know that sleeping tablets, not only do they have direct consequences of habituation, dependency, an increased tolerance, they don't replicate normal sleep. And in the long term, they're increasingly being associated with cognitive decline, once again, conditions like Alzheimer's disease in the long term. And so there's been a real sea change towards dealing with insomnia. And we now really utilize a technique called cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, which is a non-drug-based technique to try and improve people's sleep. And actually, CBTI, for short, is as effective, if not more effective, than pretty much all drugs that we have available without any of the ill effects, and is cheap and often free. There are digital versions of it that are available on the NHS. It can be delivered to you by a practitioner, but there are many avenues down which to proceed if you are having insomnia. Essentially what CBTI is, it's a form of brain retraining. It's trying to re-establish that positive connection between bed and sleep rather than bed and awake. And I think I'm going to leave it there because I'm exactly out of time. Thank you.
Do add on Slido if anybody has any questions, or see Guy afterwards. Various strange thinkers, I think Buckminster Fuller was one of them, experimented with what he called the Dimaxian sleep method, which was sort of 30 minutes at a time or something strange.
Yeah.
At frequent intervals throughout the day. Do you not really support any of those? Do you think there's no real substitute for...
Yeah, I think there's no... So people have tried experimenting with their sleep patterns over a number of years, and as you know, there's been a lot of attention on this sort of two-phase sleep that apparently was in vogue in the medieval times. But actually what we know is that you need 7.5 to 8 hours sleep for most people. There's a huge amount of individual variation, and actually a significant chunk of that needs to be in one go. And then actually it's that cycling between REM and non-REM that is responsible for many of the restorative functions of sleep, both neurological and physiological. Now, the big proviso to that is that there is actually fairly good evidence that a siesta is very good for you. So the Spanish have clearly got something down pat, which is probably why they live much longer than anybody else, in that a sleep in the afternoon is very good for your blood pressure, it's very good for your mood, it's very good for a range of cardiovascular parameters. So, but to do this kind of Übermensch method, which is kind of sleeping for 30 minutes every 4 hours, is not a good use of your time or energy.
The siesta, the problem I have with the siesta, I may just be too northern European, but when I wake up, I enjoy it at the time, but then when I wake up, I feel like shit for an hour. It may just be Protestant guilt, I suppose.
Well,
but,
no, I think you've got to get, as I alluded, the brain is a creature of comfort, and it likes to, and it gets used to certain patterns of doing things. I think the key thing with any nap, actually, is that what you don't want to do is you don't want to wake up out of very deep, the deeper stages of sleep, which you normally enter into within about 30 minutes of sleep onset and then lasts for about 20 or 30 minutes. So either you maintain a nap that is less than 30 minutes, and generally we say sort of 20 to 25 minutes, to avoid waking up in very deep sleep, or you have a longer nap for an hour and a half or 2 hours so that you're getting through that very deep stage of sleep. But actually that phenomenon which you...
That may be what I'm getting wrong.
Well, I think you're describing, we don't say feeling like shit, we call it sleep drunkenness.
Oh, interesting.
So
that's
a
an even better term
for it, yeah.
So I have got some questions flowing in here. What makes some people more prone to sleepwalking, sleep driving, night terrors and so forth?
So we think that a lot of it is to do with genetics, in that sleepwalking and night terrors is often reported by individuals who have a family history of it. But we know that a range of other conditions can also increase the likelihood of triggering these events. So occasionally I see people who have been started on certain drugs and develop sleepwalking, or who develop sleep apnea, so that's very loud snoring associated with choking or other conditions, because what those conditions do is they increase the likelihood of a partial awakening when you're in very deep sleep.
So, do you think smartwatch sleep tracking has any value? That's another good question that's come in.
Yeah, so I mean, I get asked this all the time. I think that if you've got insomnia, then sleep trackers are the tool of the devil. And because essentially what they do is they increase your focus and anxiety about sleep, and they cause people to obsess about sleep. I think sleep trackers are kind of interesting. I would prefer if people use them as a sort of, research tool rather than on a regular basis. If you don't have any issues with drifting off to sleep, that's fine, carry on using it. What you have to remember is these are intrinsically different from other devices that we use to metricize our lives. If we use a step tracker, and our step tracker tells us that we've only done 5,000 steps, then we can get up off the sofa and walk another 5,000 steps. If a sleep tracker is telling you, well, you haven't slept enough because you've got insomnia, then what are you going to do? You're not going to, you can't then go back to bed and sleep because you've got insomnia. That's the problem that you've got.
I've got another fantastic comment here from someone who said that the McGurk effect didn't work for them at all, which may mean, it's from Anonymous, which may mean you're a psychopath, because there are certain illusions that don't actually work. I think that's true, isn't it? Rather annoyingly. So there's someone. Anyway, we'd expect to have several psychopaths in the room statistically.
Yeah, so 1 or 2% of the audience will be psychopaths, but actually these you know, what you have to remember is that it's a balance between the inputs coming in and the prediction model coming down.
Yeah.
And we know that there are certain groups of individuals in whom the external information coming in overrides that. So, for example, people with mild autistic spectrum disorder, for example, and you know, actually, in psychosis, in the use of psychedelics, that internal model is stronger than the external inputs coming in, and
which is why effectively...
Which is why you then start hallucinating.
Because, by the way, anybody interested in this, there's a very good book. I think Andy Clark is the guy at the University of Sussex.
Yeah.
Is that right? Which is taking from actually Helmholtz in the 19th century this idea of the brain as prediction engine, and your take on that is that sleep is very much where we kind of reset our kind of our Bayesian prior assumptions.
Yeah. I mean, that is the way that I would envisage it, that actually one of the fundamental roles of dreaming is to retweak that prediction machine based upon our experiences of the day.
I mean, if by the way, if the McGurk effect didn't work, there's another thing called sine wave speech, which is fascinating because it reduces a human spoken sentence to a kind of sine wave noise. It sounds just like modem noise. I know the younger people haven't got a clue what modem noise is, but it sounds like modem noise. Then you hear the sentence spoken as it was originally. After that, it's impossible to unhear that spoken sentence from the sine wave noise. So suddenly, second time round, your brain makes perfect sense of this kind of sine wave speech, which is, I suppose, further evidence for this.
I mean, YouTube, if anybody's interested, YouTube is full of these kinds of videos, and I would strongly encourage you. If the McGurk effect didn't work for you, then have a look on YouTube, and if they don't all work, then you need to see a psychiatrist.
There's another great one, by the way, called Sesame Street Drops the F-Bomb, in which Grover in Sesame Street appears to say to almost everybody, that's a fucking excellent idea, when he obviously didn't. So that's a further bit of entertainment. But this is... Oh, sorry, right, okay. So
sorry. Professor Guy Leschziner, we could talk to him all day. At least a third of you want to have a chat. Please don't mob him too badly. But Professor Guy, thank you so much.